Afterwards, we'll have a conversation about the President's budget for fiscal year 2025 for the National Park Service. And I want to begin with one of the bills that we're going to be considering, which is S4209. It's legislation I have introduced to provide greater regional access to the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. Senator Daines will remember that we looked at this bill, similar legislation, 2 years ago in the last Congress. And as a result of that hearing, we heard a lot of feedback from the community. And we have been working closely with regional stakeholders and modified the legislation significantly based on their suggestions. The result of this engagement is that instead of authorizing a 42,000-acre acquisition, this bill authorizes roughly 2,500 acres, and the change was made at the request of the Trust for Public Lands, which owns the majority of the potential addition, and TPL is separately working to transfer the balance of the adjacent land to the Penobscot Nation as a working forest. As you can see from this map, what we are really talking about here is a road, a road that will connect the town of Millinocket, which is the principal town and community in the region of the National Monument, with the monument itself, rather than the current pathway to get to the monument, which is a long, circuitous route up one side. So this would be an incredible boon to the economy of that region, and that's why I've been working so hard on this for several years. Also, since the introduction of the bill, of the predecessor bill several years ago, the state of Maine has acquired an easement that's necessary for an ATV trail from Millinocket to Medway, another town in the region, ensuring there will be no impact on that important east-west connection for ATVs and snowmobiles. ATVs and snowmobiles, as they are in Montana, I suspect, are a big deal in Maine, and the trails are very important. And so working out something with the ATV clubs in the region has been an important part of the work that we've done. I want to introduce several letters of support into the record, including one from the Katahdin Region Chamber of Commerce. I also want to highlight a letter that I got from Sandra and Thomas Bell, who own the Golden Road Crossing, a local store on Millinocket Lake. They've embarked upon an expansion of their store and restaurant to be open year-round. This is a very big deal for that part of the state and employed 28 people from the local area. They attribute the growth in their business to the increased tourism to both Baxter State Park and the Katahdin National Monument. They are supporting this legislation because not only will access to the monument from the south help to increase their business, it will also improve their guests' experience. My goal remains for this legislation to help the Katahdin region continue to grow as a vibrant outdoor recreation hub that helps diversify the region's economy while not impacting the region's revamped forest products sector. In addition to the Katahdin bill that I mentioned, we're considering legislation to rename the Acadia Visitor Center after former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, who is one of the heroes in Maine of the last generation. We also have a proposal to name a visitor center after former Senator Dianne Feinstein and our colleague Senator Carper. We're also here about a proposal to establish Georgia's first national park, something Senator Ossoff has spoken to me about, and a bill led by Senators Langford and Booker to establish the historic Greenwood District Black Wall Street National Monument in Tulsa, telling the story of a horrific massacre that needs to be remembered as part of our country's history. The final bill I want to specifically mention is legislation regarding the old RFK Stadium campus in Washington, D.C. This is a bill that has already passed the House, and we have received testimony and support from Mayor Bowser. I have no objections to this bill, nor to the idea of using the site for a future sports stadium. However, I recognize that my vice chair has specific issues that must be addressed before this bill can move forward, and I hope to work with him to find a resolution. For those in attendance today, I want to note that the subcommittee will keep the record open on all bills considered here today, allowing those who wish to submit statements of support or opposition or to any of the bills be included in the official record. In addition to legislation, we're also going to examine the Park Service budget request. As this committee knows well, in recent years I've grown frustrated with an underfunding of routine maintenance by administrations of both parties. I was just at a national park last week in Antietam, in Maryland, with a bipartisan group of my colleagues, and the staff talked about their innovative use of maintenance action teams and efforts to buy down maintenance needs and using materials that last longer and require less periodic maintenance over the design life. Of course, we funded a great deal of deferred maintenance in the Great American Outdoors Act, one of the signal achievements of the last several years of this Congress, but we can't keep digging the deferred maintenance hole and expect a Great American Outdoors Act to come along every 4 or 5 years. So I hope to work with the administration, the Office of Management and Budget, and the Park Service on being sure that there's an adequate maintenance budget of these gems across the country. While this has been my recent focus on the maintenance budget, we also need to talk about staffing of our national parks. As our visitation has gone up rather dramatically in the last 5 years, staffing has not kept pace. And if we want people to have a positive experience at our national parks, we have to have adequate staff. We have to have people that can deal with the visitors and the volume of visitors that we're seeing, so that they can continue to enjoy and learn from those spaces. It's frontline national park managers in the green and gray uniforms and the famous hats that help bring history alive and keep visitors safe. This budget impacts their lives and thus the visitor experience. I worry that our frontline workers, our frontline employees are overstretched as headcount is not kept up with visitation. And I want to acknowledge that the budget does attempt to increase these staffing levels. Now I'd like to recognize Vice Chairman Daines for his opening statement. Following his remarks, I will recognize members of the committee or other senators who wish to make a statement about their bills that are on the agenda, followed by any members not on the committee who seek to make a statement. Then we'll turn to our witness, Mr. Caldwell, for his opening statement. Vice Chair Daines.
Chairman King, thank you. Today's legislative hearing focuses on 23 largely parochial bills, as well as the National Park Service's FY25 budget. I'm going to defer my normal introduction for later in the hearing, as I'd like to focus on an important issue that's before us here today. At today's hearing, we have H.R. 4984, the D.C. Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium Campus Revitalization Act. This bill transfers the administration over the RFK Memorial Stadium campus from the Park Service to the District of Columbia for 99 years. The purpose of this transfer is for the development of a new stadium as well as other commercial and residential development. Now, you might ask, why does a Montana senator have a specific interest in this bill? Well, today is about righting a wrong. Specifically, my goal is for the Washington Commanders to honor the pride, the history, and the heritage of the Blackfeet tribe, who are my constituents in Montana, for the tribe's contributions to the team's legacy. Let me tell you the story. Behind me is a photograph from the 1960s of Blackie Wetzel and Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Blackie Wetzel was a member of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana and served his people and the country in many roles throughout his life, including chairman of the Blackfeet tribe, and he was president of the National Congress of American Indians. In 1971, Blackie met with George Herbert Allen, who was then the head coach and general manager of the Washington Redskins. Knowing that Coach Allen admired and supported Native Americans, Blackie Wetzel encouraged him to replace the team's R logo with something that represented Indian country. Blackie brought Coach Allen designs based off of prominent Native American figures, including Blackfeet Chief Two Guns Whitecalf. And behind me, you'll see the logo and the photo of Chief Two Guns Whitecalf. The clear depiction of Chief Two Guns Whitecalf is beyond dispute. On behalf of the team, Coach Allen adopted the new iconic logo that's placed prominently on this beautiful helmet that I received from former players. I am proud to display it here today. Make no mistake, this logo was inspired and envisioned by Wetzel as a tribute to Native Americans. It's not a caricature. It is a depiction of pride, of strength, of courage, of honor. In fact, to quote Blackie Wetzel from 2002, he said, "It made us all so proud to have an Indian on a big-time team." And I would add that historically, as the son of a Montana U.S. Marine, do you realize Native Americans serve our country in uniform at the highest percentage per capita of any ethnic group? They are truly warriors for our country. Now you know the history. I'd like to talk about the future. First, let me be clear. I'm not calling for the return of the former team name, which has become increasingly controversial, especially in Indian country. But the logo itself remains a point of pride for many in Indian country, and specifically for the Wetzel family. I was able to speak last night with Ryan Wetzel, who is the grandson of Blackie Wetzel, who was out, in fact, in his backyard last night doing some remodeling work on a patio just outside of Hamilton, Montana. The failure to properly honor the pride and the history embodied by this iconic logo must be made right by both the team's new ownership and the NFL. Doing so would honor the Blackfeet tribe, my constituents in Montana. Showing proper recognition to the contributions of Native Americans is also fitting for our capital region. As the National Parks website points out, our nation's capital is full of American Indian heritage. Simply look outside at the names in the region. For example, the Potomac River, the Quantico Marine Corps Base, and the Chesapeake Bay watershed that spans much of the geographical region that makes up Washington's fan base. What I'm demanding here is very straightforward, that the new team leadership and the NFL sit down with the Wetzel family, sit down with the Blackfeet, sit down with tribal leaders, and find a way to properly honor the history of the logo and the heritage of our tribal nations, and to rededicate the organization as an advocate for Indian country. That effort might take several forms. It might result in restoring the logo with a new team name that is supported by tribal leaders and will bring unity across communities. It could also be telling the story of the logo's connection to the Wetzel family and honoring the Native communities it represents. When I spoke with Ryan Wetzel last night, we recanted a a meeting I had with his dad, Don Wetzel, here in Washington, D.C., talking about this very issue. That was back in 2021. Don died not long afterwards. And Ryan just smiled. You could hear him smile over the phone. He said, my dad would be thrilled to think that we're having this discussion today in Washington in honoring the legacy of this logo. It could be resuming merchandise sales featuring the logo and maybe using a portion of the proceeds to bring awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women and other tribal causes. For example, on the NFL website, you can buy a retro Houston Oilers jersey with the old logo, but nowhere on the website can you find merchandise with this logo for sale. The new owners in the NFL have the opportunity to heal old wounds, work with families, and enter into a new era. They can properly honor the heritage of the Wetzel family, the Blackfeet tribe, Native Americans across our country. They could honor former players and the community as a whole. There are a lot of former players that have signed this helmet. The team can be a beacon of light for these communities, but until I see meaningful actions that satisfy the Wetzel family and other tribal stakeholders, I cannot support this legislation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I have a number of letters, including one from Ryan Wetzel and one from the Montana Native Women's Coalition, a few news stories, and in fact, an excerpt from George Allen, A Football Life by Mike Richmond, that I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I turn it back to you and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for that eloquent statement, Senator Daines, and I look forward to working with you. And I understand there has already been a meeting between some of the interested parties here and the new Washington ownership. Is that correct?
There's been a meeting.
A meeting. Okay, good. Well, I look forward to working with you on that. I can't help but reflect when Edward Bennett Williams let George Allen go as the coach of the team. He had the immortal quote, "I gave him an unlimited budget and he overspent it, and infinite patience and he exhausted it." I thought that was, I've often thought of that quote. I did want to mention that we have in attendance today Seth Clark, the Mason-Bibb County Mayor Pro Tem and Executive Director of the Okmulgee National Park and Preserve Initiative, which we're going to be discussing later, and Tracy Rivas, a citizen and former Chief of Staff of the Muskogee Creek Nation, Director of Advocacy for the National Park and Preserve Initiative. Seth and Tracy have been leading this effort at the local level for years, and their contributions to this legislation have been invaluable in ensuring that both local interests and the tribe's voice have been represented adequately through this process, and I commend Senator Ossoff for bringing this bill forward. Mr. Caldwell. Oh, we're going to do the advocates first?
No,
oh.
Senator Van Hollen.
We'll start, I'm sorry, we'll start with Senator Van Hollen, I think. Senator Padilla.
Thank you. Coming to committee pays dividends. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also want to thank you for including 3 of my bills this hearing, 3 of my bills that would impact, for the better, the management of the California desert, which our dear friend and colleague, the late Senator Feinstein, championed like no one else. While so many of California's public lands and waters have been preserved for future generations, thanks to the singular drive and leadership of Senator Feinstein, she had a very special place in her heart for the California desert. Senator Feinstein is widely regarded as our greatest protector of the California desert. She would often discuss her fond childhood memories of the desert, where she would ride horseback and marvel at the way the light and shadows and colors of the desert played off one another to illuminate the landscape. I think in many ways it inspired some of her watercolors that she was known for during her time here in the Senate. She especially loved the desert tortoise, and she proudly showed off a poster in her office of a majestic tortoise on the very land that she had worked hard to protect. There was this one tortoise that she dubbed the 405. She nicknamed it Tortoise after the famously slow-moving freeway in Los Angeles. And if you ever brought up the desert in a meeting with Senator Feinstein, she much more often than not summons her staff, bring me the poster of 405. That's how committed she was. Now, in that light, I'm proud that one of the bills on the agenda today would rename the Cottonwood Visitor Center at Joshua Tree National Park as the Senator Dianne Feinstein Visitor Center. As the Park Service notes in their testimony, Senator Feinstein authored the California Desert Protection Act that created the Mojave National Preserve. It also expanded and redesignated Death Valley and Joshua Tree National Monuments as national parks, and designated over 7 million acres of California desert as wilderness. And so on the 25th anniversary of the passage of Senator Feinstein's signature California Desert Protection Act, Senator Feinstein wrote that the California, quote, "The California desert is a true American treasure." So what better way to honor her legacy than by forever ensuring that visitors to Joshua Tree National Park are reminded or are taught about Senator Feinstein's enduring public lands legacy. The Park Service even notes in their testimony that they plan to construct a new visitor center at Cottonwood and recommends that the committee be clear in its actions that we ensure any successor visitor center at that location also be named for Senator Feinstein. And Mr. Chair, I also have two other California desert bills on the agenda today to continue Senator Feinstein's efforts to protect the California desert. These bills would expand the boundaries of the Mojave National Preserve and Joshua Tree National Park. And I thank the Park Service for their supportive testimony in these non-controversial bills as well. Thank you.
Senator Van Hollen,
Thank you.
welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman King. It's great to be here, and I was glad to learn that you and a bipartisan group of senators were able to visit Antietam Battlefield in the great state of Maryland. I had planned to join you, but we had a family graduation, but I look forward to catching up with you. And I want to thank you, Ranking Member Daines, members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak to you on the Chesapeake National Recreation Area Act, a bill that I introduced with Senators Cardin, Warner, and Kane, and that has been introduced in the House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis by Congressman John Sarbanes of Maryland and Congressman Whitman of Virginia. As I think everyone here knows, Senator Daines referenced the Bay in his comments. The Chesapeake Bay is a natural treasure that sits at the heart of my home state of Maryland and is a watershed that includes 6 other states up to New York, as well as the District of Columbia. While there is a National Parks Office that works to improve access to the Bay, there is no dedicated Chesapeake Bay unit of the National Park Service, a surprising gap in our national park system. The idea for a Chesapeake National Recreation Area was born 4 decades ago, motivated by the desire to formally recognize the Chesapeake Bay as the national treasure that it is, and to provide all Americans with more of an opportunity to experience it. If enacted, the Chesapeake National Recreation Area Act would allow the National Park Service to, through voluntary agreements, partner with states, localities, and private entities to increase public access to the Chesapeake Bay. A Chesapeake National Recreation Area would allow visitors to experience the Bay firsthand and learn about the incredible resources and restoration effort and strengthen the culture of stewardship across the region. It will also provide visitors with an opportunity to learn about the rich history of the region and those who have lived and worked on the Bay. A national recreation area for the Chesapeake Bay would also create jobs and accelerate economic growth in the region. That designation will attract visitors to the Bay, boosting outdoor recreation, our tourism economy, including our boating economy. Importantly, the establishment of a Chesapeake National Recreation Area will not, and I want to stress this, impact water or fishing rights, supersede state authority, impose any additional regulations on recreational or business activities in the Chesapeake Bay waters, or require any sale of real estate. This bipartisan initiative has been driven by local leaders since the beginning, and it was developed through an exhaustive public outreach and meaningful collaboration process with a broad range of stakeholders. I started working on this with Congressman Sarbanes and local advocates in 2018, conducting informal outreach, developing legislative language, and soliciting technical advice from the National Park Service. We formed our working group in 2021, composed of a bicameral group of lawmakers, state government representatives, and more than 30 regional organizations. In June of 2022, the working group released 10 guiding principles outlining a framework for what the Chesapeake National Recreation Area would be. Later that year, we released a discussion draft based on the working group's guiding principles, held many information sessions with interested stakeholders, and had a 6-month-long public comment period. We compiled over 1,300 comments and integrated feedback into the bill. We finally introduced it in July of last year with strong support. The bill has garnered over 100 endorsements from local elected officials, environmental and historical preservation organizations, seafood and outdoor recreation businesses, and many more. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the 74 letters of support from groups throughout the Chesapeake watershed. And I want to thank the many organizations and individuals who contributed their time and energy to turning an idea into a bill, the bill that's before the subcommittee today. I know some of you are here in the room, and I thank you for your unwavering support. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Daines, I also want to thank the National Park Service and the agency's partnership in developing this initiative, and for the invaluable technical assistance provided by Wendy O'Sullivan from the MPS Chesapeake Bay office. Our working group, the 74 groups who wrote letters of support for this initiative, and the many others who have supported this project have made it what it is today. They have refined and improved it from the initial concept. Chairman King, Ranking Member Daines, members of the committee, thank you for the time to testify here today, and I urge your support for this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. The process you described of the development of this legislation sounds like a model of local input, and I appreciate the work that's gone in to getting us to the bill that we have before us today. Thank you for that work.
Thank you. Thank you for recognizing it. It was an exhaustive process of public input. Thank you.
Senator Langford.
Chairman King, thank you. Ranking Member Daines, appreciate the time to get a chance to be in front of you today to be able to speak in support of Senate Bill 3543. It is a bill to establish the historic Greenwood District, the Black Wall Street National Monument in the state of Oklahoma. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter of support from the historic Greenwood District, Black Wall Street National Monument coalitions into the record. Thank you. I do appreciate some of the leaders that were a part of pulling this letter together, and all the work that goes into it are here in the room today as well, to be able to be here in support of what's actually happening. At the end of last year, Senator Booker and I introduced a bill to designate the historic Greenwood District of North Tulsa, Oklahoma, where the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre took place. We wanted to designate that as a national monument. Each year, including just a very few weeks, on May the 31st and June the 1st, Oklahoma and the nation paused to reflect on the 1921 race massacre that left that community in absolute ruins. Although Greenwood in North Tulsa lost almost everything on those terrible summer days 100 years ago, the community remains relentlessly devoted to turning tragedy into triumph. They remain a beacon for our culture, opportunity, and prosperity, and they're absolutely committed to the future. While the community is committed to the future, we should as a nation also remember our past and learn from it. North Tulsa remains a place of light and hope in the community that show their strength to overcome adversity and work towards reconciliation, which is something our nation should also do and never forget. I'm grateful for the tireless efforts of so many in North Tulsa and in our state to make sure our children today and the generations yet unborn remember those lost and they understand the stain of racism and learn the powerful story of resilience and rebuilding. It's a great honor to be able to say to people that we have not forgotten about what happened. We've not ignored it. We've not swept it under the rug and pretended that it never happened. In this generation, we remember. We must also work to ensure the story and the history live on and are never forgotten. That's why this bill is so important. It's critical to note that in addition to the hundreds of Black Wall Street residents that were killed, the Greenwood neighborhood was burned to the ground, and that almost no substantial structure survived that tragic event just over 100 years ago. So this bill delineates the historic boundary of the Greenwood neighborhood as a national monument. The bill establishes in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a national monument unit of the National Park Service to preserve, protect, and interpret for the benefit of present and future generations resources associated with the historic Greenwood District, Black Wall Street, and the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, and the role of each in the history in the state of Oklahoma and of the United States. This designation will serve as a catalyst for the resurgence of this economy and cultural hub of Tulsa while helping the country understand and learn from our shared history. With all new things, of course, there are questions. With an area that's already faced so much hardship, it's easy to understand why. This bill ensures that the Secretary can only acquire land or interest in land through donation, exchange, or purchase from a willing seller. We also wrote in explicit private property protection, so there's no change of zoning, no federal control of private land at all. Additionally, the commission established under the bill will make recommendations to the Secretary for the location of any signage or potential visitor center. The bill includes a narrow waiver of one provision of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which governs the establishment and operation of advisory committees. Through the legislation, we craft language that both honors the Greenwood's past and protects its future. It's my hope that we can work to ensure that our children do not grow up in a nation that forgets their past, but also make sure it's not repeated again, to make sure all individuals are recognized and respected and every person has the same opportunity. I've worked with my friends in North Tulsa for years to secure designations on the National Registry of Historic Places and on the Civil Rights Trail. Now we're one step closer to establishing a national monument. Monument not just to the tragedy that was May the 31st and June the 1st of 1921, but to recognizing a thriving community that was there for years and that worked hard to be able to come back and has shown their resilience. The historic Greenwood, Black Wall Street area in North Tulsa deserves its place among our nation's most significant historic locations. I look forward to the testimony, and I urge support for the bill, and thank you for taking this up.
Senator Langford, thank you very much for bringing this bill forward, and thanks to all those who worked to make it a reality. Several years ago, I was traveling back home from Eastern Europe and stopped at the Frankfurt airport. And we had a guide in the airport who was a German citizen who took us around through the airport and got us to the right gate. And in conversation with him, he noted that when he was in high school, it was required for every student to visit a concentration camp. For the very reasons that you stated today, sweeping history under the rug is never good. Remembering is always good. And I was very struck by that in the nation of Germany, which went through that horrendous period, there was no effort to sweep the history under the rug, but indeed there was an effort to remind its citizens of what can happen and what did happen so that it may never happen again. So thank you again for bringing this bill forward. We're going to reconfigure the table now for Mr. Caldwell to join us. Mr. Caldwell, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us. You're a familiar witness to this committee. Proceed with your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman King, Ranking Member Daines, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the Department of the Interior's views on the 24 bills on today's agenda. I am accompanied by Kim Hall, Regional Director for the National Capital Region of the National Park Service. Regional Director Hall is here to help answer any questions you may have about H.R. 4984, which would transfer administrative jurisdiction over the RFK Memorial Stadium campus from the National Park Service to the District of Columbia. Because this hearing is also covering the President's FY 2025 budget request for the National Park Service, I am available to answer any questions on that topic, as well as on the individual bills on the agenda. I would like to submit our full statements on these bills for the record and summarize the Department's views. The Department supports the following bills. S2620, which would establish the Chesapeake National Recreation Area as a new unit of the National Park System. S2742, which would designate the Finger Lakes National Heritage Area as a component of the National Heritage Area System. S2784, which would adjust the boundary of the Dayton Aviation Heritage National Historical Park. S3195, which would designate the General George C. Marshall House as an affiliated area of the National Park System. S3534, which would authorize the Pines Foundation to establish a memorial to AIDS victims at Fire Island National Seashore. S3543, which would establish the historic Greenwood District Black Wall Street National Monument, a new unit of the National Park System commemorating the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. S4209, which would provide greater regional access to the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument by authorizing additional lands, and which includes several other critical new authorities for the monument. S4222, which would adjust the boundary of Mojave National Preserve to include Castle Mountains National Monument. S4227, which would expound the boundary of Joshua Tree National Park. S4259, which would authorize a study of Lahaina for its feasibility and suitability as a National Heritage Area. H.R. 359, which would establish Fort San Jeronimo de Boquero as an affiliated area of the National Park System. And H4984, which would transfer administrative jurisdiction over the RFK Memorial Stadium campus to the District of Columbia for purposes including residential and commercial development. The reasons for our support of these bills are explained in our full statements. For most of the bills I just listed, we are recommending amendments, and we would be happy to work with the bill sponsors and the committee on drafting them. Regarding the remaining bills, the Department supports the intent of S4216 to bring additional recognition, protection, and interpretation to the resources associated with the Ocmulgee Mounds and the Ocmulgee River Corridor. The bill seeks to do that by establishing the Ocmulgee Mounds National Park and Preserve. This unit would be composed of a redesignated Ocmulgee Mounds National Historical Park and a new Ocmulgee Mounds National Preserve, which would include within it the Bond Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. We recommend amendments that we believe will improve the bill's implementation. The Department supports the goal of S3251 to improve accessibility at the Lincoln Home National Historic Site. However, we have concerns with the bill's specific accessibility requirements. We recommend amendments to require an approach that is consistent with the current National Park Service's accessibility plans for the site and to exclude the bill's proposed boundary expansion. The Department supports the goals of S3568 and H.R. 3448 to expand the access to the American Battlefield Protection Program. However, we have concerns with the provisions relating to ensuring the continued stewardship of lands that receive federal funding and recommend amending the bill to address those concerns. The Department appreciates the intent of S4129 to assist the establishment of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, but has concerns about it. This bill would direct the Secretary of the Interior to provide a matching grant to the foundation planning to build the library and to enter into agreements to loan, transfer, or convey museum artifacts from federal agencies to the foundation. We would welcome the opportunity to address those concerns. Regarding S3241, we appreciate the sponsor's interest in designating the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians and historic Jefferson College as affiliated areas of Natchez National Historical Park. The National Park Service is conducting reconnaissance surveys on these two areas that we believe will provide valuable information to the committee. If the committee decides to act on this bill before the surveys are completed, we would recommend amendments. The department defers to Congress and does not object to 3 bills that would designate visitor centers at national park units for current or past members of the Senate. The bills are S3474, which would designate the George J. Mitchell Visitor Center at Acadia National Park, S4218, which would designate the Thomas R. Carper Visitor Center at First State National Historical Park, and S4228, which would designate the Senator Dianne Feinstein Visitor Center at Joshua Tree National Park. All 3 senators had legislative accomplishments that enhance the parks where they would be honored. The National Park Service generally discourages commemorative naming of park features for an individual except when there is a compelling justification and at least 5 years have elapsed since the death of the person. However, we recognize that Congress may specifically authorize such recognition. The department does not support in its current form H.R. 2717, which would require a commemorative work in honor of Medal of Honor recipients to be established in the area designated as the Reserve under the Commemorative Works Act, which covers the National Mall. We strongly support locating this monument in a place of honor and prominence, but not in the Reserve. The department has worked to protect the Reserve by discouraging the establishment of any new commemorative works within it. Finally, the department recommends that the committee defer action on 2 bills. One is S2742, which would establish the Fort Ontario National Monument as a unit of the National Park System. We are currently conducting a special resource study of the area to determine whether this site would meet the National Park Service's criteria for designation as a new unit. We recommend waiting to act on this bill until the study is completed. The other is S3242, which would expand the boundary of Atchafalaya National Heritage Area to include Lafourche Parish. We recommend waiting to act on this bill until an amendment to the original study for this National Heritage Area is prepared, which will enable the National Park Service to make a determination about whether the proposed addition is appropriate. In closing, we commend the thoughtful work of all the members who have developed the bills now before you, several of which have been years in the making. We look forward to working with bill sponsors and the committee on amendments to address the concerns we have outlined in our full statements. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have on these bills or on the President's FY 2025 budget request for the National Park Service, and Regional Director Hall would be happy to answer any questions on H.R. 4984. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Before we begin our questions, I want to thank you, and by extension, all the members that work, all the people that work for the National Park Service for the extraordinary service that they provide to our country. All the visitors that come, it's so meaningful and so important. And to those of us who have visited a variety of national parks, the people make those special places even more special. So please convey the thanks of the committee to all of the staff of the National Park Service for the wonderful work that they do. You testified that you support the legislation I mentioned at the beginning that would improve access to the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. If it's passed, the Park Service could then negotiate either to purchase the fee of the road or a right-of-way. Given your experience, how long do these kinds of negotiations usually take?
Well, I think each situation is different, but knowing the players that are involved up at this particular unit, I would guess those discussions have already begun as this legislation was introduced. I don't want to give it a timeline, but certainly with Katahdin Woods in particular, I think given the proposed legislation and the access that you spoke to earlier, we realize it's a priority And I know the park staff, the regional staff, and the lands office staff in the Washington office will take it as a priority.
Well, one of the issues that we want to pay special attention to in this is that this is a logging area.
Yes.
And it will remain so. And we want to be sure that that the access is safe. And I hope that you can continue to work with the commercial logging community to ensure that there will not be an impedance of their work, but also that visitors can access the monument safely. Can you describe how that kind of process
Sure,
works?
yes, sir. We take visitor safety very seriously at all units, and certainly the park works to ensure that visitors are aware of the logging trucks and have the right-of-way on the roads and aware of the monument. We make sure visitors are aware of this through website work, through brochures, as well as the visitor contacts, the personal contacts that we have in the unit up there.
And that's something that you've been able to do successfully in other parts of the country, I take it?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you. Finally, on this bill, there's a provision that allows the Park Service to acquire up to 10 acres for operations and maintenance. Would this provide sufficient flexibility for you to adequately be able to operate the monument?
Yes, certainly in that particular unit where we are there to protect the resources, preserve those resources, having the ability to be able to set up administrative facilities on lands outside that particular boundary will be much more conducive to us to set up that operation and give us an opportunity to make sure those resources we're there to protect stay that way, but also be able to, whether it's tie in with local utilities and things like that. It's a wise way to go.
And I want to be clear that what this bill does is provide access. It's essentially a road, either ownership of the road or a right-of-way, not significant additional land added to the size of the national park. We're talking about access, not additions to the acreage of the monument.
Correct. That's correct. This is about access to the national monument.
Mr. Caldwell, to change the subject, S4216 redesignates a historical park as a national park. In looking through the history of what it is you administer, I find 25 different designations for types of units: gardens, preserves, forest parks, mountain parks, 3 types of battlefields, 3 historic designations. Is the management of these various assets different according to the title under which it falls? In other words, is a National Historic Park managed differently than?
Any superintendent, and I speak as a former one, will tell you how they manage starts with the enabling legislation. So whatever that park, whatever the nomenclature of that park is, it's tied into the national park system where the Organic Act and management policies and that particular enabling legislation will dictate what you do with things like the superintendent compendium and the allowance of different types of uses.
Should we consider talking with you, having a roundtable of some kind to talk about how to perhaps rationalize this process so the public isn't confused as to what's what?
I'm not sure where you want me to go with that question, but yes. I do believe during the centennial there was a discussion, actually I think as part of our national systems plan that we transmitted over to this committee about a year or so ago. There was this discussion about nomenclature, and I think it's a topic that is certainly worthy of further looking.
I think it's worth our committee's consideration, just again, to be sure the public has
Yes,
some
sir.
understanding of what these different names and designations mean.
Yes, sir.
Senator Daines.
Chairman King, thank you. Got a couple questions for Mr. Caldwell. Before, I just want to give a brief introduction and overview of some of these bills. There's a lot of important bills that they just went through there, Mr. Caldwell. Senate Bill 3568, the American Battlefield Protection Program Enhancement Act, would improve the protection of Americans' historic battlefields. I'm proud to co-sponsor this bill with Senator Hyde-Smith. Look forward to seeing it signed into law. Senate Bill 4129, the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Act, would allow the establishment of the Theodore Roosevelt Library in Medora, North Dakota, with the Theodore Roosevelt National Park and Medora, North Dakota, just 30 minutes from Webo, Montana. I'm excited to hear more about this proposal. Finally, H.R. 2717, the National Medal of Honor Monument Location Act, would allow the placement of the monument devoted to Medal of Honor recipients on the National Mall. Medal of Honor recipients, through their service and sacrifice, are the highest example of American exceptionalism, and it's important that they are honored properly. I know that placing new monuments in the reserve has been controversial in the past, so I'm looking forward to hearing more from the Park Service about their concerns. Finally, my office has received a number of support letters for various bills on today's agenda. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that they be included in today's record.
Without objection.
Now, a couple of questions. Mr. Caldwell, Montana is home to a number of battlefields administered by the Park Service, including the Big Hole Battlefield in Wisdom, Montana, the Little Bighorn Battlefield near Hardin, and the Bear Paw Battlefield near Chinook. Senate Bill 3568 expands coordination of the battlefield programs to include tribes. How do we ensure that tribal voices are heard at the Park Service, especially when it comes to these battlefields that have deep and sometimes painful histories with our tribes?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Senator. Grants awarded by the NPS's American Battlefield Protection Program are helping to tell those stories of indigenous people experience, what they experienced, how they experienced American history through these conflicts. Specifically, one of the grants, the Preservation Planning Grant, APP, the tribes are eligible for those grants to help plan, do interpretation programs, and things like that for tribes. Tribes are eligible for those grants. Eligible projects focus on battlefields or associated sites in the United States. And then lastly, you mentioned, beyond the grant program, you mentioned several units of the National Park Service, and certainly I know that we do a lot of collaboration with tribes on the interpretive story of those different units. As a former superintendent of a Revolutionary War battlefield, we certainly worked with the Oneida Indian Nation to tell the story of the Mohawk Valley in New York State. And so I think it's part of the core of our interpretive program. No matter the story, it needs to be told, as both of you indicated earlier, as well as Senator Langford.
Mr. Caldwell, today's hearing also examines the Park Service budget. Our national parks are one of a few things that brings us all together on this committee. But I'm concerned that we are seeing a shortfall when it comes to prioritizing our national parks over other more political and divisive issues the Department of the Interior is currently pushing. How does the Park Service's budget support increasing the number of full-time employees in our parks?
The President's FY25 budget proposes to fund 19,953 full-time equivalent employees, FTE, across all funding streams. FY23 actual FTE usage totaled about 18,900. It's important to note that the FY23 FTE level is approximately 15% below the FTE level in FY2010, despite having many new units added to the system, over 30 units since 2010. Additionally, the FY24 enacted appropriation did not fund fixed costs, requiring parks to absorb over $100 million of those costs in their existing budgets, and made additional funding reductions that led to the loss of purchasing power and therefore FTE in our operations account. This FY25 budget proposes to restore those reductions.
You know, one example of talk about FTEs and employees and importance of supporting employee housing. An example we have in Yellowstone National Park, where I grew up nearby. Superintendent Cam Shawley is doing great work to increase housing for employees, but he can't do that alone. How does the budget help expand housing for Park Service employees in gateway communities? It's not just about attracting the best to serve the National Park Service, but also to retain them. I think housing is an important part of that.
Yes, sir. Certainly brought up a great example in what Superintendent Shawley's doing at Yellowstone. The FY25 request proposes more than $100 million for housing across multiple appropriations. That includes an increase of $9 million for the Housing Improvement Program, which supports new construction and rehabilitation, more than $60 million in Great America Outdoors Act deferred maintenance housing projects, $2 million to support leased housing in local communities, where the park will go into a community and lease apartments or whatever it is for their seasonal employees in particular, as well as other projects across the funding streams.
You mentioned a little bit about the maintenance there, and I know the chairman here and myself believe that fixing the maintenance backlog is a bipartisan issue. We both strongly support it. But I fear that instead of the number being reduced, we're actually seeing it grow. And I don't think we can depend on Congress passing another, Great America Outdoors Act every 50 years to deal with the backlog. We've got to get ahead of it here in our budgets. How does the budget support cyclic maintenance so that assets don't continue to pile up on the deferred maintenance list?
The budget proposed, the FY25 budget proposes a $5 million increase for cyclic maintenance projects for a total of $193.2 million. And as whether it's Acadia or Yellowstone, cyclic maintenance is really a central element of the NPS effort to curtail deferred maintenance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
$5 million isn't very much of an increase. And I spoke to the director of the Office of Management and Budget about this, as well as the Department of the Interior. This is something we really have to attend to. We just can't continue to defer maintenance and hope that there will be another Great American Outdoors Act. That's going to be a hard sell for the vice chair and I when we tell our colleagues we need more money for deferred maintenance when you're still deferring maintenance. So I hope that in future budgets, we will have a stronger emphasis on ongoing maintenance. For the record, I would appreciate it if you would give us an analysis of the staffing levels in the across the national parks in 2010, and then what we have today graphed against visitor growth and number of units growth. Sure. Because my sense is that we're just not keeping pace. And I understand the Fiscal Responsibility Act and the constraints that we're all operating under, but this is such an important issue that I think it's worthy of some study. So I hope you can do that for us for the record. The Park Service, I think, received, as I recall, $500 million under the IRA for additional staffing. Has that been spent? How is that being allocated, and how long will that last?
So the National Park Service received $500 million in IRA funding to hire employees and units of the National Park System, National Historic and Scenic Trails. We've identified approximately 1,500 positions across parks and trails, and we're in the midst of hiring those positions right now. The funds are available through FY 2030, and the parks have planned their hiring to be available across the full time period. And funds will be exhausted in 2030 of those IRA funds.
Talk to me about fee revenues, particularly with regard to foreign visitors. I could see a differentiation in fees based upon Americans who are paying taxes to support the parks and those who are visiting the parks who aren't subject to that additional support for the parks. Is that something that we could explore? Is there additional revenue possible in the fee structure?
Yeah, I think the fee revenue and the Recreational Fee Act is something that I think our staff would welcome an opportunity to discuss with the committee and your staff.
Thank you. I see that Senator Hyde-Smith has joined us. I want to welcome her to the hearing. And Senator Hyde-Smith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Daines. I have 3 hearings going on right now that I'm trying to get questions in on all of them at the same time. But thank you for being here today as well. And I see some Mississippians back there. We certainly appreciate your presence. This bill is extremely important because of the rich history of Natchez, Mississippi, which is one of the premier historical tourism destinations in my state. It's only about 45 minutes from my home, and it sure is a shining star for us. Looking first at the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians, a national landmark, this location interprets the story of the Natchez people who originally lived there. And the Grand Village was the last ceremonial mound center of the Natchez people in their homeland. It was also the site of the 1730 battle between the Natchez and the French that ultimately led to the expulsion of the Natchez people from Mississippi. Historical Jefferson College is another location in Natchez that is steeped in deep in history. It was Mississippi's birthplace, the intellectual center of the old Natchez District, and served as a Freedmen's Bureau site after the Civil War. Jefferson College is nationally significant also as the most intact and most complete surviving college complex from the early American period of 1785 to 1840, notable for the architectural integrity of this building and for the overall integrity of the early college landscape. I introduced this bill to support these two historic sites by amplifying their stories not only to Mississippians, but to all Americans and visitors from around the world who are drawn to Natchez. I understand and respect that the National Park Service has a process for determining affiliated area status for historical locations, and that process is currently underway. I don't want to impede or hinder that process in any way. I want to show my support for this endeavor and stand ready to help however I can. Before I get to my questions, I want to mention letters of support for this endeavor from the Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves, Natchez Mayor Dan Gibson, who's doing an awesome job, and the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, which is the state agency tasked with preserving and protecting the historical resources of Mississippi. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter these into the record as well. But the question one, Mr. Caldwell, I first want to thank you for your team at NPS for responding to my request for surveys of these two sites in Natchez and for working diligently to come to a determination, hopefully by the summer of this year. Can you please provide specifics at what sort of analysis is needed at this point in the study to reach a final determination?
Yes. Thank you for the question. We are, in both sites that you mentioned, we are fully underway with our reconnaissance survey and have gotten to a point where we are now reviewing them internally within the National Park System, within the Department of Interior. And I think we would look forward to a chance to brief you and your staff on the status of where that is over the course of the summer. And we look forward to completing that study and getting it back to you in an efficient time.
Thank you very much. And will you commit to me that the NPS will work with me and my staff on these locations because they have deep but undeveloped ties to existing NPS sites already within Natchez? And I certainly appreciate your willingness to provide recommended language and additional information, anything that we need to add to that, and just the commitment there.
Yeah, we're happy to work with you and your staff on that.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I understand Senator Padilla is on his way back. A couple of additional questions. Assuming no increase in responsibilities, which is not accurate, but assuming that, how much additional funding would the Park Service need to maintain the same staffing and service levels as in 2023? If you need to take that for the record, that would be fine, but if you have an answer.
Yeah, there's always new responsibilities, as you imagined. And earlier we discussed the overall budget request for FY25, and I think we'll, in terms of the specific numbers to hold a steady state and things like that, that's something I'd like to work with our budget team to follow up with you on specifically.
Thank you. Talk to me about housing. Well, let me back up.
Sure.
How are you doing on recruiting? How are you, every business I talk to in the country is having workforce problems.
Yes.
Are you having similar problems, or are you being able to attract the people that you need?
I think similar to businesses across the country, like you said, recruiting is always a challenge for us, particularly in areas where we may not have the housing to offer to bring folks out to different communities. We have a recruitment office in the National Park Service now, so we're more strategic as an agency to recruiting different candidates to come into the National Park Service. But housing is certainly one key element of that recruiting that has to be done. And so in places like Acadia, where we have just an incredible friends group who's partnering with the National Park Service to ensure that we can increase our capacity for dorm rooms, or they actually purchase a bed and breakfast and can provide housing. We have a number of those examples across the park system in other parts of the country where partners are stepping up to work in collaboration with the National Park Service to help bring in more capacity so that that can be an important component of recruiting.
So the Park Service is recognizing housing is now a part of recruitment?
Every superintendent I talk to about housing reminds me that housing is an important part of their recruitment.
And now, how are we doing on visitation? We don't have a graph, but is it an upward trend? And how did we make it through how was visitation during the pandemic?
Well, certainly, we have a number of places across the country that have seen a dramatic increase in visitation. Not everywhere, but certainly places like Yellowstone, where the infrastructure largely at that park, where visitation has skyrocketed, was built in the 80s or even earlier. And so that's why it's been so vital to have the Great America Outdoors Act making these generational investments, not just a Band-Aid approach, but a generational investment where our children's children will have the same access to these sites, these parks, these places that we enjoy with our families. So visitation, certainly across many parts of the system, continues on an upward trajectory.
Thank you. Senator Padilla, welcome back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I wanted to acknowledge that Senator Daines brought up one of the issue areas that I was going to chime in on relative to housing, and even as it relates to staffing issues at several of our parks and its impact on maintenance and the user experience, if you will. So I want to associate myself with that line of questions and hope to be part of the discussions to invest and make additional improvements there as well. Given the extra time, then, I can turn to other issues, one that's garnering a lot of excitement in Northern California. The ORU project at Redwoods National and State Park is a potential landmark arrangement between the Yurok tribe, the National Park Service, the California State Parks, and Save the Redwoods League. So I very much support the Park Service moving forward in formalizing a co-management paradigm that captures the values of the tribe and Redwoods National and State Parks. Question for Mr. Caldwell: does the Park Service need funding or any statutory changes to bring this arrangement and other tribal co-stewardship agreements to fruition?
We could certainly get back to you specifically on the funding question with that, but the co-stewardship priority has been made very clear by both the Secretary and Director. We appreciate your support on that. We look forward to seeing that continue.
So, and I got to imagine it's a model that we are considering and implementing in areas well beyond California, but proud to tout California as a leader in this particular space. Now, Mr. Caldwell, one of my priority programs in the National Park Service budget is the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership. Our offices have been in touch on that, which funds park projects in urban and low-income communities. This program is critical for closing what many refer to as the nature gap, right? The discrepancy in access to outdoor spaces and experiences for different communities. That's why I've introduced the bipartisan Outdoors for All Act, a bill to codify and improve this program. Can you reiterate why driving funds to this program is so important and how the program benefits communities around the country that don't have comparable access to parks?
Sure. Well, I think it's a very important program of the National Park Service. Those type of external programs that put resources into communities that may not be close to a national park or may need areas, different facilities to enjoy recreation. So that will continue certainly to remain a priority in FY25.
All right, thank you for that. And, I know just providing that access, whether it's proximity to a park is just half the battle. In many of the more popular parks and facilities, oftentimes it's not just, well, it's not that far, I know how to get there. Got to make a reservation. And so we deal with reservation systems. And I want to ask a question about reservation systems through the lens of equity. Initial data looking at reservations in the national park system suggests that this nature gap is also visible in reservation systems. Users of the reservation systems tend to be wealthier, more highly educated, and the communities of color are not as significant users as other counterparts. What best practices is the National Park Service considering in designing equitable reservation systems, and what resources do you need from Congress to make these improvements?
Sure. Yeah, I think we could get back to you and your staff and the committee staff on what our business services operation, who runs our reservation system, what they're looking at to ensure equitable access to those reservation systems.
Okay, I just want to make sure that as we're trying to improve the experience, that we're not losing sight of equity. Again, equity in physical access, but the reservation system being so key, particularly in the more popular parks, that it's functioning the way that we envision it, consistent with our nation's small d democratic values. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The distinguished senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Daines. A pleasure to join you, and thank you for accommodating me. I'm grateful to you for including in this morning's hearing S 4216, my legislation to establish the Ocmulgee Mounds National Park and Preserve, as this is an initiative with overwhelming bipartisan support in the state of Georgia, extraordinary local support. I think, Mr. Chairman, you were kind enough to recognize earlier today Seth Clark, the Macon-Bibb County Mayor Pro Tem and Executive Director of the Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve Initiative, as well as Tracy Rivas, who is a citizen and former Chief of Staff of the Muskogee Creek Nation and Director of Advocacy for this park initiative. This is some of the most extraordinary territory in the United States, continuously inhabited for more than 12,000 years by members of the Muskogee Creek Nation, exquisite and invaluable cultural artifacts, gorgeous woodlands along the banks of the Ocmulgee River. And I'm grateful to the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior for working so closely with my team to develop this legislation. We look forward to working with both of you on a bipartisan basis to incorporate any technical advice that's necessary to advance this legislation to the Senate floor. But I just want to emphasize that not only will this be transformative for Middle Georgia and its economic development and its tourist economy to establish Georgia's first ever national park, but it also will be a powerful statement about the relationship between our state and the Muskogee Creek Nation and its history, and an opportunity for Georgians to enjoy outdoor education and outdoor recreation in gorgeous woodland, riverbanks, and cultural sites. So thank you, Chairman King and Senator Daines, for your consideration of this legislation. I'm ready to work with you to make sure that it gets over the line.
Thank you, Senator. Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Caldwell, for your testimony and for the work that the Park Service does. As I mentioned at the beginning, I learn a lot at these hearings. Today I learned there's a community in Montana called Wisdom, so I'm going to refer to my colleague here as the Senator from Wisdom from now on. I want to thank you again, and we will hold the record open for additional comments and suggestions over the next few days, and look forward to working with you, Mr. Caldwell, and the National Park Service on these meritorious bills. Thank you very much. The hearing is closed.